As Olin said, my name is Tim Tucker with the Robinson Helicopter Company. And what I'm going to talk about, it kind of sets the foundation for everything that's going to be said after me. And that's how we manage the energy, where the energy is in the rotation and how we manage it. And it really doesn't matter what make and model you're in, it's how and where you manage the energy that becomes important in the rotation. Now, before we talk about energy and where it is and how we manage it, we have to know about the conservation, the law of conservation of energy. And it states that energy can neither be created or destroyed, and the total energy of an isolated system remains constant. So the moment your engine quits, you are now an isolated system. The amount of energy you have at that point that engine quits is all you're going to get. Nothing you can do after that engine fails to increase the amount of energy that you have. So you might want to think about that when you choose what altitude or what airspeed you're going to fly at, because you'll be an isolated system once that engine quits. However, it can change form and be transferred from one area to another. So you can change it from potential energy to kinetic energy, or for that matter, mechanical energy to electrical energy. You can move the amount of energy that you have available around. You just can't increase it at all. Now let's talk about how, where, and when we store and use energy in an auto rotation. We store energy, or two types of energy, in the helicopter. The first is kinetic energy, or the energy of motion. And we can calculate this kinetic energy using this 1/2 mass times velocity squared. We can replace mass with weight. So 1/2 weight times velocity squared. The important thing to understand here is that the velocity is being squared. So changes in velocity are going to produce big changes in the total amount of kinetic energy. Changes in weight will produce a change in the total kinetic energy, but since it's just 1/2 that weight, that change is not going to be anywhere near as significant as changes in velocity will be. We store this kinetic energy in two areas. We store it in the speed of the rotor and the forward speed of the helicopter. Now, actually, I've kind of simplified things here because the rotor RPM energy, it's really rotational energy. There's a slightly different formula for that, but it's a little bit more complicated. It has some Greek letters in it. And so I'm just going to keep it simple and use this same 1/2 mass velocity squared. And then the other place is in the forward speed of the helicopter. Now, here's a chart that shows the amount of stored energy in the forward speed of an R-22 at various different airspeeds. And you notice we have airspeed along the bottom here, and this is energy along the left-hand side, expressed in horsepower seconds. So 1 horsepower second of energy would be the amount of energy to produce 1 horsepower for 1 second. So, for example, let's say I had 100 horsepower seconds of energy. The light here is given out, I think. Let's say I had 100 horsepower seconds of energy. I could produce 100 horsepower for 1 second. Or if I wanted to spread that out, I could produce 50 horsepower for 2 seconds. Or maybe I really want to spread that out. I can produce 1 horsepower for 100 seconds. So we're going to use the term horsepower seconds for energy, okay? And you can see here at 50 knots, can you see that light? Yeah. Here at 50 knots, we produce 250 horsepower seconds of energy in this little R-22 at maximum gross weight. Okay? Now, if we double that speed up to 100 knots, you see we much more than double the total amount of kinetic energy. And that's because that velocity is being squared. So speed becomes pretty important. Speed in the rotor and speed in the helicopter. We also store energy in the form of potential energy, or the energy of altitude. We can calculate that by multiplying our weight times our height above the ground. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple different flight conditions. We're going to analyze the total amount of energy we have in those flight conditions. And then we're going to say the engine quits. And we've now become an isolated system. We'll look at some different alternatives on how to use or manage that energy in this isolated system. So we're assuming here an R-22 at maximum gross weight, 1,370 pounds. 90 knots, 500 feet. This is the way the rotor RPM breaks down. In our, our energy breaks down. In our rotor RPM, we have 100 horsepower seconds of energy. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. If we went back to the chart we just had up, we'd see that at 90 knots, this R-22 produces 800 horsepower seconds of forward speed energy. And if we took the potential energy of altitude, calculated that out, we see that we have 1,100 horsepower seconds of potential energy of altitude. Now, let me go back to the rotor RPM there, 100 horsepower seconds. If we actually took the weight of 1/2 the weight of a blade times its velocity squared, and then multiplied by 2, since R-22 has 2 blades, we see there's a lot more than 100 horsepower seconds of energy. The problem isn't using that energy. As Nolan mentioned a moment ago, as soon as that RPM begins to come down, it gets to a point where you can no longer access the energy that that spinning rotor is making. It still has speed, and it still has weight, so it's still producing energy. But because of the aerodynamics of the stall, we can't get at that energy. So we can actually only use about the top 25% of the energy that a rotor produces. So we have 100 horsepower seconds. All right, so you add that up, 90 knots, 500 feet, we have 2,000 horsepower seconds of energy available when that engine quits. Now let's say we're gonna, upon this engine failure, we're gonna try to use the energy here to maintain airspeed and altitude. Now I'll admit, when your engine fails, probably the first thing you're not gonna wanna think about doing is maintaining airspeed and altitude. But for the sake of our discussion, that's what we're gonna try to do. Maintain airspeed and altitude. Well, an R-22 rotor needs about 90 horsepower to maintain airspeed and altitude. Since we're trying to maintain our airspeed, we can't use any of that 800 horsepower seconds we have stored in our airspeed. And since we're trying to maintain our altitude, we can't use any of that energy we have stored in our altitude. Only place left where we store energy is in that rotor, where we only have 100 horsepower seconds. So we need 90, we have 100 available. Just divide that out, we would use up all the energy in that spinning rotor in 1.1 seconds. Now you can't say, well, okay, that's a little R-22 with the low inertia rotor system, that's why it's only 1.1 second. So that's not really true. It's right in that 1.2 seconds for pretty much all helicopters. Doesn't matter about the inertia in the rotor, because remember, we're using all that energy. We're pulling the collective up, so we're using it. So it doesn't matter whether it's in that little R-22 or back in my Army UH-1. It'll be about the same 1.2 seconds. Where inertia comes into play is if we do nothing. We just leave the collective there, and how slowly that rotor decays, that's where inertia comes into play. When it comes to using it, it's about the same. Right? 1.1 second, not a lot of time. Now let's say this pilot does everything perfectly. We're going to give him all 2,000 horsepower seconds to use, and he does everything perfectly. Enters perfectly, perfect glide, flare, everything. Well, an R-22 rotor needs about 75 horsepower in an auto rotation, and we're not maintaining straight and level anymore. So we need 75 horsepower. We have 2,000 available. Divide that out, we'll be on the ground in 26 seconds. A lot of time. 26 seconds. Certainly a whole lot more than that 1.1 seconds. And here's how it would go. All right, here's our clock for 26 seconds. When the needle split, that's going to be the engine failure. Here we are at 90 knots, 500 feet. What we're going to do is we're going to slow from 90 to our normal 65 knots for the auto rotation. Here we have our rotor RPM, 100 horsepower seconds. Here's the forward speed, 800 and 1100 horsepower seconds of potential energy. And here's how that 26 seconds is going to be used. Whoop. There's quite a delay. There. Needle split. Notice we slow to 60. We're using the potential energy of altitude to create a descent rate so that we maintain the energy in our rotor. We get to the appropriate altitude to begin to use the energy of our forward speed in our flare, saving this rotor RPM energy till the end, which we use just prior to ground contact. 26 seconds. Okay, here it is. Okay, one more time here. Okay, now we're going to reduce the airspeed and bring the altitude down. And look at the big changes in the amount of energy that we have. So this isolated system has substantially less energy available than the previous example. Now we still have 100 horsepower seconds in our rotor. It's still going at the same speed. But look at the difference in our forward speed energy and our potential energy of altitude. Some pretty big reductions there. So now at 60 knots, 100 feet, we only have 666 horsepower seconds of energy available. Substantially less. Now, if we want to maintain airspeed and altitude on the entry, it'd be the same as our previous example, because the only place we can get energy is our rotor. We only have 100 horsepower seconds, so it'd be the same 1.1 seconds. However, if we give the pilot all 666 horsepower seconds to use, things are going to happen a lot quicker. Now, it'll be just 9 seconds before the aircraft is on the ground. And you'll notice here, things go a lot quicker. Most of our energy, you can see in this example, is in the forward speed of the helicopter. And we've had big reductions in the potential energy of altitude. We still have 100 horsepower seconds in our rotor. Note how quickly this 9 seconds goes. So we want people flying higher and faster. So with that engine quits, the isolated system you've now created has a lot more energy in it. Now I've kind of used this term 100 horsepower seconds somewhat loosely. Let me try to translate that into what it is. Those of you who've flown an R-22, when you reduce the RPM from 104 down to 75%, which is in essence a hovering auto rotation, you've just used 100 horsepower seconds of energy. So in that little R-22, when you do a hovering auto, you've just used 100 horsepower seconds of energy. You can get the same amount of energy as that entire hovering auto with an airspeed reduction of just 6 knots from 90 to 84 knots. That little 6-knot reduction in airspeed produces the same amount of energy as that entire hovering auto did. And I don't know, many of you may be familiar with Pete Gillies from Western Helicopters, and his big theory is called cyclic back. And he actually thinks, especially in higher speed situations, 140, 150 knots, that aft cyclic is as important. In fact, if you talk to Pete, he might even say it's more important than lowering the collective. Where he's coming from is from this energy standpoint. That reduction in airspeed puts so much more energy up into the rotor to prevent excessive rotor decay. However, you notice that the slower we go, the more of an airspeed reduction it's going to take to get that same 100 horsepower seconds of energy. Again, faster is better. And for every 46 feet of altitude we fall, we recover 100 horsepower seconds of energy up through our rotor. All right, now this video is going to be a demonstration of someone who has an engine failure and does an absolutely excellent job of managing the energy that's within this isolated system that she has when the engine fails. Her name is Julia Link. She's a tour pilot in Hawaii, and she's got 2 tourists on board. Interestingly, the tourists in the back seat, the doors are off. It's going to make it a little bit more exciting for the tourists. They're at 1,600 feet when the engine quits. She makes a slight turn to the left looking for an area, doesn't see one. She turns back to the right looking for an area, selects an area, and then maneuvers towards it. Note also, as the helicopter is getting lower and lower to the ground, the tourists in the back seat are getting a little bit more concerned. You can start to see by their body language, their facial expression, they start gripping on to something that they can hold on to as they're getting closer and closer to the ground. But she does a pretty darn good job here of managing the energy available. You'll see when the engine quits, there'll be a slight nose left and you'll hear the horn go off. Right there.
Fantastic.
Turns a little bit to the left looking for an area. Notice the tourists in the back, they're not sure what's going on. She comes back to the right. Notice the knuckles are starting to get a little white. Wow. White. Turns to the tourist and she says, engine quit. Happens. And, she has the presence of mind to keep the passengers inside the helicopter until she gets the rotor stopped. Thought that was really pretty good on her part.
The oh shit.
Yeah. And I felt there was a little tick when I was telling you about Detroit, and I was like, uh-oh. And then it quit. Yeah.
All right, so you can see an excellent job there of managing the energy that she had available. Interestingly, I guess it's probably been about 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was in Anaheim, one of the heli expos, and we did the same Autorotations reality expos that we're doing today. And unbeknownst to everybody in the audience, Julia Link was sitting back in the audience. And so once the whole video played and everything like that, I introduced Julia and had her stand up. And I'll tell you that everybody, about the same size crowd that we have here today, maybe even larger, everybody just gave her a standing ovation. They wouldn't stop clapping for 5 minutes. It was really pretty good. I might add, Julia's now flying airplanes. Okay, we're gonna wait questions till the end.